Okay. Today we've got another post. I've been trying to maintain a weekly cadence. Obviously, if not, I've been doing okay with that. But, I was at Southeast Linuxfest this past weekend, hence why nothing went up on Sunday. And it took me a few days to really collect my thoughts and put them in a state where I felt comfortable sharing them. This was a very different experience for me this year. This is my fourth trip to Southeast Linux Fest, and you know, it's been an enjoyable experience overall. It really has been, but this year was a bit of an eye opener, and so we're gonna discuss that. But today's post is called the Self 2026 My Golden Ticket to Vibeville. So you already know it's going. Okay, so when I started writing this, it was on Sunday morning. Things were finishing up. I opted out of going to any sessions on Sunday as I normally do. Every once in a while, I'll go to one, but usually after absorbing so much information on a little bit on Friday and then most of the day on Saturday, I'm just kind of like I'm ready to go, right? So that was more the same this year. I don't usually go to Sunday sessions. I was planning on going to one, but then I realized after reading the description, I had actually been to a very similar session presented by the same individual a few years back, and it was good, but I was like, yeah, it's time to go home. So, yeah, I'd rather get started on that 90-minute drive, right, when it came down to it. So, as I start writing this, I'm sitting there on Sunday morning. I'm sitting at the communal table in the lobby of the Sinesta Charlotte Lower South End Hotel, right, at the end of South 2026, Southeast Linux Fest. And, for those of you not familiar, Southeast Linux Fest is... there's a few Linux fests that are held around the country, and South is probably one of the smaller ones, as I understand it, although I've never been to any of the others, so this is merely hearsay. But every year in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is about 90 minutes from where I live here in South Carolina, they have this Linux Fest, and it's basically just a bunch of Linux users get together and we dish and we talk about things, and people give presentations, and it's basically a community experience with other Linux users. As depending on what you do in life, you probably don't know that many Linux users personally. If you're one, like, it's not something that comes up very often outside of like enterprise IT type of things, so something to think about there. Anyway, it's nice. It's nice to meet other people who are at least somewhat aligned with you from a software standpoint, right? And so, this is my fourth year in a row going. I really like going because it's like, I think I've characterized it in the past as just being able to drink from the pool of things I really like about tech. Unfortunately, this year it wasn't as good for me. It just wasn't as good for me as it probably was for others. And so why? Well, in I realize yeah, I realize I need to do a little editing here, but obviously the answer comes down to AI, right? So in 2024 there was a single session on the schedule that was AI related, and that was in the emerging technologies track. In 2025, there were 4 sessions that were AI related, and they were on the emerging technologies track. This year, there were 7 sessions, and they're part of the artificial intelligence track, which, basically, is a shot across the bow of, look, this is not going anywhere. It is here to stay. And this is particularly depressing to me the more I think about it. Mostly, and we'll get into why near the end, but this is not a good sign in my view. So technically, that's only 3 additional sessions, but it's basically become impossible for me now to escape the feeling that AI is literally everywhere now, as it is devaluing and devolving the rest of this trade throughout, in a wide variety of professional circumstances. I guess part of me thought that we could at least escape it here. No, we can't. So that was naive on my part, as it turns out. So from my perspective, it's obviously not a good thing. You might be surprised to hear, though, that I actually went to a few of these sessions. Why? Well, I believe in trying to understand things even when I don't agree with them. Part of me really, and I mean this, I really do, want somebody to sell me on the idea of this being AI and LLM assisted coding. Make it make sense. I would rather that I'm wrong, then almost everyone else be wrong. Like, this juxtaposition just keeps getting more. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just burrowing into my brain, right? But nobody managed to accomplish that task. I did not go to all 7 of these. I think I went to about 4 of them. So, although one of them I was stoned off my ass, so I don't really remember that much about it. We'll get to that. Anyway, the most surprising part of this phenomena was ESR. That would be Eric S. Raymond's. And if you were, reading last week's blog post, you'll realize that I quoted ESR and his famous, essay, "The Cathedral and the Bazaar," right? Which is just a really, it's a seminal event in the free and open source software movement, right? In any event, if you want to understand more about that, you can go back to last week's post. But so ESR actually comes to this session, comes to this conference, which is something I referenced last week. It's always nice to see him. I don't always agree with everything he says. I never come out of an ESR session thinking he didn't put a lot of thought into this, right? He thinks long and hard about positions before he espouses them, and that's good, right? That's really good. I did not come away feeling that way this year. So he had a couple sessions. One of them was his kind of standard geek political thing, and I've been to a couple of those in the past, and they can be interesting, but they're very meandering sessions, and apparently this one meandered a great deal too. My buddy who came with me went, and it meandered its way into talking about religions and whatnot, which really got under the skin of some of the attendees apparently. So that is what it is. I think I opted for retro computing. No, it was the day before. I think it was in a Strix Halo 6-month Linux review session instead of that one. So, which was probably a good choice on my part. Although that involved a lot of AI too. That's one of the AI sessions I went to. But I own 2 pieces of Strix Halo hardware, 2 framework desktops, so it felt very applicable. Okay, so let's continue. So his ESR session, How to Succeed at AI-Assisted Coding Without Really Trying, was frankly the apex of the depression of the event for me. The title kind of hints at it, but going into it, I really didn't know if the title was in jest or not. And with ESR, it could very well be in jest, right? So, without really trying, this could have been just here's why vibe coding sucks thing, right? But it wasn't. As it turns out, ESR has pretty much fully bought into the AI LLM coding trend, and even went so far as to liken those of us who want to keep writing code by hand to people who still insist on blacksmithing, and people who still insist on keeping retro computing alive. That last one really hit because I like retro computing, and I think that there's a lot of things we can learn from how things used to be. Those who don't, if history repeats when it comes to those who don't know it, and they can't identify trends and cycles, right? So I was thinking he was a rational guy, and this was not a rational session. I hate to say it. I hate to levy that kind of criticism at the man, but that's largely how I feel about it. There was a bit of back and forth going on in there, but I was mostly just like shell-shocked. But so when pressed about the intellectual property concerns around the reality that these frontier models, which he claimed to be pretty much exclusively using, he wants the most powerful models he can get his hands on, he doesn't care, right? So when somebody pointed out that these models have been trained on code that absolutely, almost certainly was not properly licensed to allow for such a thing to happen, ESR basically responds by asking, well, are you against people learning by reading books? If not, then why are you against LLMs learning by reading code? I briefly raised my hand at that point to follow up to that. My intended follow-up question was, yes, but when an author who has read somebody else's work produces work that work verbatim or close to, it's considered plagiarism. How is this any different? But I thought better of it, because he continued by pointing out, in response to another audience member's statement/question, it was a little weird, that the people against LLM-assisted coding were exactly like the people in the past who were against higher-level languages that made coding more accessible as opposed to something like assembly. With that response, I could see that ESR had fully gone down the irrational rabbit hole of AI, and no words from my mouth were going to change that. So rather than disrupt the session, because most people seem to be getting what they came for, I by attempting to mount a serious challenge to this, I decided to just let it go. I don't want to. I'd already sat through a couple sessions with this one old guy. Just like there was one guy who gave a presentation on turning an old Raspberry Pi 3 into, like his DNS and DHCP server and NTP server. And he shows this Docker file, and I guess he ran it through an LLM or some kind of scrubber to clean it up, and it introduced a few syntactical errors in this Docker compose file. And there's this one old guy at the beginning who just can't let it go, and he's QAing the dude's file as he's going through his spiel and putting it up on the screen. Like, it's just a minor detail, man. Let it go. But I didn't want to be that guy in the audience, that kind of asshole who's just ruining it for everyone. It's just, yeah. So yeah. When I did have a chance, I could have asked a question, but I wasn't going to get anywhere anyway. So anyway, up until this point, I was toying with some code that I got inspired to write as a result of some of the earlier sessions that I, ironically enough, attended, which were about retro computing, namely around what it takes to create and produce a game that runs on actual Sega Genesis hardware using modern tooling. That session was amazing, by the way. In any event, that session got me thinking about a recent tiny game idea I had. Nothing particularly original. It's just something to dip my toe into the pool, right? But instead of writing that game, I got inspired to write a program to devise the most optimal solution to that game, which is a very well-known game, right? It's not an original idea, let's be clear. But so it's just for fun, right? Anyway, by the time I got into ESR session, which was directly after lunch, I had written a good chunk of code. Alas, none of it was actually working. That wasn't really a problem, though. There were no deadlines. There's no JIRA ticket. There's no story points. There's nobody breathing down my neck. I was doing this thing for the pure joy of doing the thing, because I wanted to do the thing. It was totally pointless, right? And a largely theoretical program that, if functioning correctly, would produce the answer to a question that I could literally obtain with less than 30 seconds of search engine work, if I really wanted it. But the answer wasn't the actual goal. That wasn't the thing I was focused on. For the first time in years, I actually felt the spark, the urge, the motivation, the compulsion to write pointless code, not for any particularly useful purpose, but solely for the fact that I would enjoy writing it. I cannot tell you how foreign that feeling has become for me, and how refreshing it was to experience it again. And so, to expound on this just a little bit more, I've been writing code professionally for 27 years now. Like, I started in 1999, and I coded recreationally a lot before that. I started learning to code when I was 6 years old. In fact, I should have pulled out the book for this. This would be a great video to show it off in, but it is what it is, right? So I used to write code just for fun when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and before I started, doing this for a living. And even for the first 15 years of this, 20 years really, I was writing code recreationally, although by the end it was mostly a momentum-based thing. I had like a CMS system instead of this static Hugo site I'm running now, right? A custom CMS system that I would maintain. And at some point, I just realized that this is just more work than I'm willing to put into it. Like, I didn't really want to code on my own. So, up until this point with this little side thing, with the game solution thing, the only thing I've been coding at home on my off hours are just bash scripts for jobs on the Raspberry Pi and Home Assistant automations, Home Assistant templates, which if you really want to find a new way to bang your head against the wall as a professional software engineer, go learn Home Assistant automations, man, specifically the templating language, because whew, dog. Can't say I'm a fan. Anyway, I stomach my way through it. It's really meant for non-engineers, which is why if you don't have any engineering background, it's probably a lot easier to pick up than if you do, because it breaks my brain, man, in so many ways. Anyway, so, after that session, I found myself starting to wonder, am I the problem? right? Am I? With the introduction of that quandary, my progress exploiting this little side dimension of computing joy came to an abrupt halt. So, to keep the existential crisis at bay, of course I popped an edible, because what else does the stoner do? Then I went to another semi-tongue-in-cheek session on AI. After that, I decided to head to the LAN party room, which, on a side note, was a very muted experience this year compared to previous years. Not really sure why. We were in a new hotel this year that we had never been in before, and I think that part of the issue here was that in prior years in the older hotel, the LAN party room was like right there mixed in with the conference rooms. But in this particular facility, it's actually on the other side of the lobby. So you had to, go out from the area with all the conference rooms, the registration, all the other self things, cross the lobby, go past the dining and the bar area and all that. And then down the hall, past the elevators up to the rooms, there's a big room that they had the LAN party stuff set up in. And so it was much more out of the way, much more chill and muted, which is, anyway, I don't know. I didn't spend a whole lot of time in there, but, yeah. So anyway, I did end up in that room. And, I decided, I'm going to get back to work, right? After the session after ESRs, right? And I pull out my travel keyboard, which is a low free flow 100 or something to that effect. And, this is a relatively new keyboard, and I don't travel that much, so I don't use it that much. And plus, I carry a ThinkPad, so I already have a decent keyboard. So it's kind of superfluous to have a travel keyboard, but it can be nice. Anyway, so when I plug that in, of course, the function keys don't function as function keys, and I'm trying to write code, so I actually need the function keys to control the debugger in VS Codium for the .NET stuff I'm doing for that little thing I'm playing around with, right? Because I'm writing in C#. And so I go down the rabbit hole in true Linux fashion. One of the most traditional things that happens, and it doesn't happen to me very often because most of my tech problems in Linux have long ago been solved. But this fucking travel keyboard, let me tell you something, not solved. It was a problem. Anyway, I go down the rabbit hole. I eventually figured out. Now keep in mind I had popped an edible, so my capacity to solve this problem is diminishing with the greater amount of time it takes me to solve said problem. So I did eventually come up with a workaround. Anyway, there's probably a better solution, and I will figure it out at some point. But I really like the keyboard. I just needed the function keys to work consistently in Linux, which, until I decided to write some code, wasn't that big of a problem. Like that wasn't like a huge concern because for most everything else I do, I don't need function keys that often. But yeah, anyway, yeah. So that's just a classic Linuxism that bit me in the ass, right? Yeah, and so I haven't returned to that code yet, although I tend to. I'm off this week, but God, I have so much shit to do. It's crazy. Anyway, later on that night, I was having dinner with my buddy Kelly, who came with me to the conference this year, and it was so awesome. Thank you so much for that. It was nice. It was nice having somebody to tag along with and go to sessions with and things like that. He's a good guy, great friend. After that, I'm just, I'm following up my weed with booze, and I'm just like, so I go back up to my room at some point. I pass out after briefly coming back down to check out the retro rag shoe session and getting a look at somebody's replica PDP-11, which was running off a Raspberry Pi, and that was cool. That's really what I came down there for, because there was a session on that, another retro session that I didn't get to go to, and I kind of wish I'd gone to that one instead of whatever session I went to. But yeah, that thing was cool as shit. Like just the actual getting a taste of what it was like to use Unix on the first machine I ever run it was kind of sweet. Anyway. And he even paired it up with like retro. He actually had a real dumb terminal there. He got working, and he had a cool retro term, I believe is the name of the terminal emulator, which actually emulates like an old school phosphorus screen, stuff like that, and it'll do green screens or whatnot too. Really cool piece of software. If you're into retro stuff at all, probably a total waste of GPU power, but really cool nonetheless. Anyway, so. I went back down for that for a few minutes. I went back upstairs because, the basketball game, which ended up being the final basketball game, and the finals started. And then I pass out in the fourth quarter, wake up in fourth, just in time to watch a championship, get won by the Knicks. So that was pretty sweet. It was good timing for once in my life. Anyway, back to the coding project. Listen, I could just ask Claude to do it. I could fire up a local LLM on my framework desktop and ask it to do it. But you know what? That wouldn't be any fucking fun, would it? If I was just going to do it that way, I could just fire up a search engine and get the answer. This is a game that is popular. People know it. I could literally, I don't want to say the word Google, but I could search engine my way to an answer within 30 seconds. I have no doubt. The most optimal way to beat that game, right? Everyone's played it. Everyone knows what it is. And it's just, yeah, little fun little side dimension of software development for me. Anyway, the thing is, the reason I don't do that is because the destination isn't really that important. The finding of that answer isn't that important. But I just want to do it in a way that is interesting, and writing the code to get there reminds me of so many of those little projects I used to do as a kid, where I would just fuck around with things, man. Hey, I wonder, if I can write a program that does a bunch of these mathematical calculations and it'll run overnight and give me the results. I used to do shit like that all the time, right? And, looking back, so much of it was just pointless and mired in a lack of understanding as to the thing, but they were interesting steps in my development as an engineer, and how I look at tech is I was empowered to discover things, right? I was empowered to build these abstract tools that would produce results that I considered to be valuable to me at the time. And I think for me, that's the most important thing. I think for a lot of other people, it's not the most important thing. People aren't concerned with writing good, clean code so much as they are with just getting to the finish line. They don't really care how they do it. They just want to get there. And so in their view, the finish line is the answer to the question I'm trying to answer. Their view is that the finish line is the product, and they don't really care about the in-betweens. But, the journey is the meat of life. The destination is just a transition and whatever the next journey happens to be, right? And to be fair, it took me a long time to appreciate this and recognize it. And it's hard. Even every day, I still have to kind of force myself to remember that. Things happen, things come up. So it's not... yeah, it's a difficult thing. And I still grapple with trying to integrate that into my daily living, right? In any event, my primary takeaway here is that AI and LLMs are taking the joy of the journey away from software engineers, and a lot of us seem quite content to embrace that new reality with open arms. I obviously do not count myself among those who feel that way. Now, I'm sitting here editing this post and getting ready to film the YouTube version of it a few days later. I gotta say, my feelings on this year's Southeast Linuxfest were pretty mixed. I think this largely boils down to the idea that the embrace of AI LLM technologies by free and open source software advocates is a rather offensive idea to me. Namely because you cannot guarantee that the software produced by an LLM is free and unencumbered by other intellectual property concerns, because you have no idea what lineage or inspirations are attached to said code. You don't know what it was trained on. You don't know what the weights are. You don't know anything about it, right? And that's the thing, right? The whole point of FOSS is to allow the users to remain in the driver's seat when it comes to dictating what their software does, how it works, and how they use it. But how can you accomplish that when you inform an innate dependency on an opaque AI model that is hosted in a variety of data centers and is made available only to those who can afford to pay the per token rate? To me, this trend spits directly in the face of what the free and open source software movement is actually about. Anybody advocating for it has clearly not fully thought it through, and has instead decided to embrace the vibes over the much more difficult path of maintaining a rational disposition in the face of overwhelming professional pressure to adopt such tools. At the end of the day, the question I can't answer or forget is, of course, what can I do about any of this? The answer, of course, is I have no fucking idea. Let me know if you figure it out, dear reader, viewer, if you will. And yeah, thanks for joining me. I know that this has not been the most optimistic post or reading. And as for self next year, I mean, I was pretty heavily toying with the idea of doing a presentation myself next year. I'm not so sure now. I don't know. Maybe I will just to see if I can, I don't know. Really, I don't know what things are going to be like a year from now. This whole AI LLM thing may have blown itself to bits by then. It's likely that, the situation with AI and LLMs will destabilize a great deal once we get past the IPOs for these shit companies and things start to go south, right? But who knows what it's going to look like a year from now. It might be just straight up. There might be a mad rush of people trying to get local hardware so they can run their own LLMs locally. I don't know. Like, I hope that next year there will be less sessions on this. And I don't know what it is I would speak about next year. It's really going to be driven largely, and I don't have to know that, or at least have an idea of it until a couple months beforehand, should I actually go through with it. And I still want to do that. I just, I want to, I don't know. At first, this has been a rather depressing trip for me to self, but it also is emboldening me when it comes to, trying to add maybe some different viewpoints into the mix here. And I think there are viewpoints that are sorely needed in some cases, especially when it comes to this particular issue. Anyway, that's all the news that's fit to print. And thanks for joining me. And I hope you all have a spectacular week. See you soon. Bye-bye.